I'd like to welcome you to this public meeting of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board. This is just one meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine renewal lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City, with leases commencing or being renewed on or after October 1st, 2019, and on or before September 30th, 2020. I'd just like to welcome Patty Stone, who's the new owner representative to the board, who was appointed very recently, and we welcome her to service on the board. I will now take roll call. Please respond if present. Shayla Garcia, Leah Goodridge, Cecilia Sosa, Patty Stone, present. Alex Schwartz, present. Herman Tejeda,
Present.
Scott Walsh,
Present.
May Yu, David Reese, present. Let the record show that we have a quorum. The preliminary vote for rent-stabilized renewal lease adjustments will be held on May 8th. Let the record show that May Yu has arrived. The preliminary vote for rent-stabilized renewal lease adjustments will be held on May 8th at the Great Hall, Cooper Union, 7 East 7th Street in Manhattan, starting at 7 p.m. Doors will be open at 6 p.m. There are copies. Sorry, let me correct. I made a mistake. The preliminary vote for rent-stabilized renewal lease adjustments will be held, the correct date is on May 7th, at the Great Hall, Cooper Union, 7 East 7th Street in Manhattan, starting at 7 p.m. Doors will be open at 6 p.m. There are copies of the most current 2019 meeting schedule in your folders, and it can also be found at our website, nyc.gov/RGB. Copies of our schedule are here today. If you're interested in receiving email updates about upcoming RGB meetings and hearings, please take one of our flyers that are here today, or you can sign up by going to the board's new homepage at nyc.gov/RGB. Follow-up RGB report memos were produced by staff to address questions that were asked at our previous meetings. In addition, a memo analyzing HCR hotel and rooming house owner registration data was also completed, as well as a memo containing data from HPD. These memos were emailed to the members prior to this meeting, and they're in their folders. In addition, there's a policy brief from Citizens Budget Committee regarding location affordability. You will also find in your folder proposed language for the apartment and hotel orders in anticipation for the vote on May 7th. This language was emailed to the board members prior to this meeting. Please note that the annual filing of the Conflicts of Interest Board Financial Disclosure Report filing period has begun. The filing period will end May 3rd. We will begin today's meeting testimony from our apartment tenant panel. This afternoon, we will hear testimony from our apartment owner and hotel tenant panels. Please note that in your folder, there's testimony from Solomon Borg on behalf of stabilized SRO building owners. Mr. Borg presented testimony to the board last year, and he wanted to appear in person at today's hearing, but he is out of town. Let me turn to the agenda and welcome to the front Stephanie Sosa, Oksana Mironova, and Tim Collins, if they are here.
Same thing.
Should we proceed? Okay. Stephanie, would you like to begin? Thank you.
You have to hold it down, correct? Yeah, just push it in. Just push it. So can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
As long as the green light's on.
Awesome.
If the green light's on, you're good to go.
It's on. Good morning. Thank you, Chairperson Reese and board members, for this opportunity to testify My name is Stephanie Sosa. I am the Senior Associate for Housing Development Policy at the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development, also known as ANHD. ANHD's mission is to build community power to win affordable housing and thriving equitable neighborhoods for all New Yorkers. As a coalition of over 100 community-based organizations in New York City, ANHD works at the intersection of organizing, policy, advocacy, and capacity building to support our members and build equity and justice in their neighborhoods and citywide. Our extensive network of affordable housing developers have built and currently manage over 135,000 units of affordable housing in New York City. Every year, our members create and preserve hundreds of rent-stabilized units across the 5 boroughs. Neighborhoods throughout New York City have, in recent years, seen a significant rise in speculation by for-profit entities trying to maximize their bottom line through the housing market. New York City residents have experienced displacement due to harassment and rising rents, putting the city in a major housing crisis. We recognize that rent-stabilized apartment buildings incur several types of expenses in order to operate efficiently. However, conversations with our membership and our analysis suggests that a disproportionate share of these costs are being passed on to tenants by increased rents. ANHD's membership of community-based, mission-driven nonprofit developers have a history of keeping operating expenses in their buildings low to minimize tenant rent increases while still maintaining safe and affordable housing. Furthermore, they do so while operating 100% affordable buildings and without the added revenue generated from the share of market rate units found in many for-profit owned rent-regulated buildings. And so what I mean by that is, I like to call it cross-subsidizing. When you have market rate rents in a building, you can use those higher rents to cross-subsidize the operating cost or the deficiency in the lower rents. And so it is important to note that the affordable housing buildings that our members operate are based on market principles and have access to operating subsidies that are also available to for-profit market rate developers, also including small landlords. This is true for our small organizations who operate as few as a dozen buildings, as well as our larger members who have portfolios over 1,000 units. ANHD members utilize low-interest loans and tax exemptions offered by HPD for moderate to major rehabilitation of occupied buildings. These programs assist with many repairs, also help in reducing the cost of existing buildings that carry high utility costs and real estate taxes. Perfect examples of these programs are the Participation Loan Program and the Multifamily Housing Rehabilitation Program. These are low-interest loans that are offered through city capital that have a unit cap based on the need for the rehabilitation. They also provide partial and full tax exemptions based on the needs for the repairs. There's also the very popular Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Preservation Program, also known as Year 15. And this is available for like-tech properties that are beyond their initial 15-year compliance period that are in need of rehabilitation. HPD will provide, similar to the programs that I mentioned, a 1% interest loan and offer a full or partial tax exemption. This program is extremely important because many of the Koch era housing that was developed in the late 1980s and early 1990s are now up for expiration since we're 30 years later. And we are currently at an expiring use crisis where we're losing hundreds of thousands of units, or at risk of losing hundreds of thousands of units a year, both managed by for-profit developers, and many of our nonprofit members are using this program to preserve that housing and keep these units rent stabilized. Then there are other programs, including the Green Housing Preservation Program and the J51 tax And these are just examples of different programs that are available for for-profits, for nonprofits, for large landlords, small landlords to take advantage of to keep operating costs low and to maintain quality in their housing. So now I just want to quickly go into the price index of operating costs, something that we have said in past years, and that our members are committed to, are sharing concerns about the accuracy of the PIOC. Based on an analysis that I did, I saw that there is a discrepancy between the PIOC and the income and expense report analysis. When you look at it from a 27-year span, since 1990 was the first year that data was being collected by the Rent Guidelines Board, there has been a 124% increase in the PIOC compared to 115% increase for the INE, income and expense data. And so there is an overstatement there, and the Rent Guidelines Board claims that there's a difference in how the data is collected, and that's why there's a discrepancy, but it's just something that I want to take into account. Also, when we look at the disparity between projected and actual expenses in recent years, it is pretty significant. It has led to an increase in net operating income for landlords, which the Rent Guidelines Board has also mentioned in the report. And it has been at the expense of working poor and middle income New Yorkers. When you look at the NOI in 2017, there's a 0.4% increase in NOI, which is not very high at all, and that's something that we recognize. But when you go back to 2016, there's a 4.4% increase, and then back to 2015, a 10% increase. So when you add all of those numbers up, it's a pretty significant increase that landlords are benefiting and profiting from rent-stabilized housing, and yet New Yorkers continue to be rent burdened. When you look at the housing vacancy survey, there is a significant amount of rent-stabilized households who are also rent burdened. Sorry, I lost I'm just looking at numbers now. About 53.2% of rent-stabilized tenants are currently paying more than 50% of their household income in rent. 53.2% of rent-stabilized tenants are paying about 30% or more of their income in rent, and 26.7% are paying over 50% of their household income or more. For households living in unregulated housing, the numbers are similar but lower. And so we are increasingly troubled by the share of New Yorkers paying such high proportion of their income on housing, whether in rent-regulated or unregulated units, as this puts families at risk for cutting costs in other expenses that they have in their households. It is imperative that we protect the city's stock of affordable housing as the housing vacancy rate continues to lower and tenants' rental obligations continue to increase, resulting in unfortunately high rent-to-income ratios. This year is a critical time to minimize any rent increase for tenants and put in place historically lowest rent increases to date. We urge you to consider these issues as you contemplate this year's Rent Guidelines Board decision. Thank you.
Stephanie, thank you. I had a couple of questions about your testimony. You say that ANHD's members have been able to keep costs low. I'm trying to understand, are you saying that that they're keeping costs lower than other landlords, or that the numbers being reported to the RGB may be overinflated? So is it something about your membership, or is it about the data?
So it's a combination of both. So we believe that, and I don't have the data in front of me to prove it, but we believe that there is an overinflation of the operating expenses, but at the same time, our members are reliant on HPD subsidies that limit how much a nonprofit can use on operating expenses. They also have in place, when they preserve a building or when they build a new building, there are reserves in place that allow them to tap into in order to take care of any operating expenses so that they don't fall on the backs of our tenants.
Just following up on that, we had heard testimony a couple of years ago that if landlords don't get like a minimum of, roughly 2% increase each year, that they're going to fall into distress. And am I to understand from your testimony that there's really no meaningful portion of your membership that is facing those circumstances, that you don't have a significant number of members who are in distress, with buildings in distress?
So our members, because they're using HPD subsidies, they're using low-income housing tax credits, they are constantly renovating, and I don't want to, they're not using MCIs and renovating every 2-3 years, but every 15 years, they will be renovating their buildings. And of course, our members take increases into consideration. They're extremely important, but again, I mentioned that because of the structure of the HPD subsidies and what is required of them when closing on a deal, they are able to tap into any reserves that are in place. And of course, there are a number of situations, a handful of situations where our members' buildings or a portfolio is falling in disrepair, but for the most part, that would be an anomaly because they have the support of the city, the state, and federal subsidies to take care of those situations.
Thank you. And then my second question is your critique of the PIOC, of the price index of operating costs. You say that over time the RGB has overstated expenses because of the PIOC and the differential between the PIOC and the income and expense study. I'm not sure. I need to think through whether I agree with that or not. But let's say you're right about that. What does that tell this year's board to do? If there's been a historical overstatement, does that affect our decision this year, or is it just kind of a general statement about the ability to foresee costs?
I think it's just a general statement about foreseeing costs. And I actually put together a chart, which I forgot to share with you, but I'm more than willing to share with you
Please.
afterwards. But it just shows the difference in the PIOC and also the income and expense study. And so it's less about using that as a measure to determine a rent increase and more of a measure of seeing any overstatements or anything that has been overlooked in the data.
Okay, thank you very much. Do other members have questions for Stephanie?
I just have a clarification on that. So it's less than they're different data sources. So I definitely don't agree with your position, but we're talking about less than a 9% change over a 27-year period. So the delta between these two metrics is less than 0.5%. That would be very much within the margin of error of anything that's done statistically. So
Yeah.
I don't think it's a strong point at all.
So I agree that the difference is not as increased, but there are other considerations to take into account. Of course, we have the data to rely on, but then there are also other factors that are not provided in the data. And so these would be qualitative factors, including something that I mentioned before, which is high speculation in neighborhoods. And this also puts rent-regulated buildings at risk. At ANHD, we have been tracking buildings that are at risk that are being sold on the speculative market, and those also include rent-regulated buildings. And so I understand the disparity between the data, but at the same time, we need to take into consideration that prices are very high. Rent-regulated tenants are also rent burdened and severely rent burdened. Majority of them are very low-income residents, and we just have to think about other factors that are outside of the data sources as well.
Do you have additional information on that piece that you just shared? Either the quantity of buildings that have rent-regulated units that have been sold recently based on speculation, and what the increases in costs of those rents have been?
So this is data that ANHD has recently started collecting, and so I don't have that information in front of me right now, and I don't want to quote any numbers without actually knowing that it's reliable, but it's something that I'm more than willing to share at another time.
We would appreciate it if you could send that follow-up information.
Okay.
Right. And also just a clarification question on your response to David earlier about the reserves. Can you explain a little bit more about, are those reserves from, so I understood it to be just reserves that each individual developer, if nonprofit mission-driven, has in their own accounts.
No, so reserves there are operating reserves, there are social service reserves, there are different types of reserves that are required by HPD for a project. It really depends on how the project is packaged, what type of subsidy sources are required. Usually with lower income units and also like homeless units, there's a higher reserve requirement, and so that is put in place prior to the building being constructed or being renovated, and it's kept in place in order to help with any operating expenses.
Sorry, I guess, who, is that city?
Yes.
Okay.
It could be city,
reserves.
state, or federal, depending on, like I said, the package.
Okay.
Because usually our members and a lot of developers of affordable housing will
Public
use
funding.
different subsidy sources. And so every project looks different. And I can't guarantee that every project will have a reserve, but for the most part, the city will ensure that there's a reserve requirement for a building that is using city subsidy.
The city does not have enough subsidy
Right.
for all apartments.
Right,
So
right.
It's always going to be a small program.
Right. So I guess just kind of with that in mind and understanding your response to some of David's question, it's that you're seeing, based on your membership, a smaller increase in costs for operating costs for rent-regulated buildings year over year, and you're attributing that possibly to the fact that they have another source of public funding to help subsidize operating costs? Is that what you're?
Yeah, it's a mix of things, and like I said, it's really difficult to speak very broadly about affordable housing in New York City because it really ranges. We consider rent stabilized housing affordable housing, and then there's light tech, there's supportive housing, and there are just so many different mixes. But I would say yes.
And my last question, has ANHD surveyed your membership to understand what their increases in operating costs have been?
We have not. We don't have hard data on those numbers, and it's something that we should definitely start collecting. But these are just overall having conversations with our members who manage over 1,000 units of affordable housing and have been in the field for over 40 years doing this work in the city, developing housing, and can speak very quickly to what they see and what they've seen in their projects over time.
Yeah, I know this is a question for you or just in general, but does the PIOC differentiate between nonprofit owners versus for-profit owners of rent-subsidized housing?
It doesn't, no.
Just for clarification, in your testimony, you say, as well as for our larger members that have portfolios of over 1,500 units, you're talking about individual not-for-profits with over 1,500 units each?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have two more questions, Stephanie. One is, a black box for us at the RGB is to understand what the debt service portion of the budget is. Could you talk to that to some extent for your members? You know, what percentage of every dollar of revenue is spent on debt service?
So, and again, I'm going to refer to HPD funding because these projects are very structured. Usually they stick to HPD's guidelines of 1.25, I believe.
A debt service coverage ratio of 1.25?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Just given recent economic conditions, so one of the board's reports reflect that the economy seems to be doing a little bit better, and that's spreading out a little bit to New Yorkers more generally. Do you have a sense of tenant arrears? Have they been improving or getting worse in the last year? Do you have any sense about that for your members?
I don't. I just know that our membership, they work really closely with their tenants who are in arrears. I don't have any data on that information, unfortunately.
Thank you. Any other questions from the board? Okay. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Oksana Mironova, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Oksana Mironova, and I'm a housing policy analyst with the Community Service Society. CSS is an anti-poverty organization that's based in New York City. And thank you so much for the opportunity to present our concerns about the potential impact of the rent guidelines on low-income New Yorkers here today. The decisions of the...
Actually, let me jump right in. We did pass her testimony out earlier. Yeah, it's the colorful one. So if you want to follow along with what she's doing, you got
Great.
it.
The decisions... Good? Yeah. The decisions of the Rent Guidelines Board are among the most important factors influencing the well-being of low-income New Yorkers. As illustrated in Figure 1, 365,000 low-income households live in rent-regulated apartments in New York City. That's twice the number of those who live in public and subsidized housing combined. According to recent data released by the U.S. Census, New York City's population has been declining since mid-2016, even as the city continues to add jobs. Housing affordability is likely contributing to this decline. As illustrated in Figure 2, that's back on page 1, median asking rents increased by 29.9% above inflation between 2014 and 2017. For comparison, asking rents between 2011 and 2014 went up by just 2.1% above inflation. Looking back further and focusing in on stabilized units, median rents have grown by 30% above inflation since 2002. The dual culprits for this rapid rise of stabilized rents were both high RGB guidelines during the Bloomberg-era administration and the impact of rent law loopholes, which allow landlords to raise rents well above the annual guidelines. Median unregulated rents also rose substantially since 2002, increasing by 43% above inflation. This widened the gap between the typical regulated and unregulated apartment to $430, thus making regulated apartments even more important for low-income New Yorkers. Rents have far outpaced incomes in stabilized apartments. Even though the median rents climbed by 30% above inflation, the typical stabilized household was earning the same inflation-adjusted amount in 2016 as in 2001. The income gap between regulated and unregulated units has doubled from $11,300 in 2001 to $22,000 in 2016, a result of new luxury development and also vacancy deregulation of stabilized apartments in Manhattan below 96th Street. Rent-stabilized apartments are not income-tested or subsidized for the most part. However, controlled rent growth makes them more accessible and affordable to low-income New Yorkers, more so than unregulated units. As illustrated in the chart, Figure 5, in 2017, median rents paid by a low-income household living in a rent-stabilized apartment was around $240 lower than the rent paid by an unregulated household, accounting for borough building size and building age and apartment size. However, rents paid by both stabilized and unregulated tenants have increased substantially since 2002. Among low-income stabilized tenants, the rent increase was 26% above inflation, and among unregulated tenants, the rent went up by 21% above inflation. According to the latest income and expense analysis, landlords of stabilized buildings spent about 59 cents on the dollar on operations, thus generating 41 cents in income. Historically, operational expenditures have fluctuated between that 59 cents to about 65 cents. As illustrated by the dark blue and pink lines in Figure 6, RGB annual rent guidelines have, over the years, tracked closely to about 65% of PIAC projections. These escalations provided landlords with enough revenue to operate a rent-stabilized building while generating a profit. After the rent freezes in 2015 and 2016, rent growth that can be attributed to RGB one-year rent guidelines fell below the price index cost projections. But at that point, it began to track with the average cost of operating expenditures. And Stephanie spoke to the differences between the two. As illustrated by the red line in the graph above, collected rent growth, which accounts for both 1 and 2 year leases and increases above RGB's annual guidelines, has far outpaced both cost projections and operating expenditures. Collected rent growth has risen more quickly than RGB's annual rent guidelines, partially because of rent law loopholes. Low rent guidelines over the past few years seem to have mitigated the negative impact of those loopholes, stabilizing the growth of collected rents. Rent-stabilized tenants' incomes have not kept up with rising rents. Among low-income renters in particular, inflation-adjusted rents increased by 26% since 2002. As a result, the median rent-to-income ratio, the share of income a household spends on rent, among low-income stabilized tenants specifically, increased from 40% in 2002 to 52% in 2017. With high rent burdens and limited choice within the market, because low rent apartment vacancy was about 2% in 2017, many low-income New Yorkers find themselves in extremely difficult housing situations. Among low-income stabilized renters, nearly half reported being unable to afford a $25 increase in rent in 2018. For those households, even a small monthly rent increase can exacerbate housing insecurity, leading to doubling up eviction and homelessness. RGB's decisions have a real impact on the well-being of low-income tenants in New York City. Over the past few years, the Rent Guidelines Board has begun to pay more attention to tenant economic conditions while setting rent guidelines. This has provided a dose of much-needed relief to tenants. The RGB should institutionalize this practice and make its decision-making process a little bit more transparent. With skyrocketing rents, diminishing low-rent housing stock that leaves tenants with minimal choices if they're priced out of their rent-regulated unit, and evidence that landlords are generating 41 cents in income on every dollar, we recommend that the RGB continues to issue low-rent guidelines for this upcoming year. Thank you.
Thank you, Oksana. I have a few questions. I'm just going to kind of track along with your presentation. I was unfamiliar with this fact that you said that New York's population is decreasing. How much has it decreased?
It was a small drop. The data came out about 3 weeks ago.
Okay.
It was going down the boroughs. I think it was just a couple of thousand in every single borough, and every single borough experienced a small drop besides Staten Island.
But just so I understand, roughly
Yeah.
flat, a little negative, but not.
It's not a huge drop,
Okay.
but it's kind of like a shift in the trend that's been going on since the previous 10 to 15 years.
And so what's your explanation for why rents are increasing if there's a little less demand because population is dropping? What's your theoretical model as to why rents are increasing if population is dropping?
That's a really good question, and kind of like the crux of all of these discussions, because landlords are continuing to be able to charge more in rent, despite the fact that there's a demand. Yeah.
An observation, just in the sense of how many people live doubled up in New York City, you know, and so you might have a general drop in population, but there's just so much people that are in need of apartments that's not, it's a wash. you might drop, but there's so many people that can't afford that are literally stuck inside somebody else and renting a room.
Yep, definitely.
I just have a question about figure 1. The statement that there's 365,000 low-income households who live in regulated apartments in New York City, twice the number who live in public and subsidized housing combined. There's about 180,000 units in the NYCHA program. NYCHA thinks their population is 400,000. There's some who think their population is 600,000 because there's many people who aren't on leases and who aren't known if they live in the apartments or don't live in the apartments. So I'm just, how's that twice?
Yeah.
When NYCHA says their population is 400,000?
Yeah, so I'm talking about households, not individuals.
Okay, go ahead.
When you, the inflation number, is that just general inflation, or is that inflation just in the cost of landlords? Can you explain that?
Yeah.
Being new to the board.
Yeah, it's general inflation, so it's the consumer price index.
Okay.
Yep.
You in the report, I'm not sure if you actually said this in your spoken remarks, but you say, landlords of stabilized buildings spend about 59 cents out of every revenue dollar on operations, thus generating 41 cents in income. I just want to clarify, so that 41 cents could be profit, it could be expenses that are not included in the PIOC, and it can include debt service. So it's not income per se, right? It's in excess of maintenance and operations. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. And then finally, in your figure 8, you talk about the share of low-income tenants unable to afford a $25 increase in monthly rent. So obviously, we have a very blunt instrument on the board. We get to control one number for the entire housing stock. How should this data impact our decision when we really only get to make a decision for the average of the median household?
Right, yeah. That's absolutely a really good point, just because a percentage means different things to different people, and it really depends on both how much money you earn and how much your rent is, right? But I'm very much here to speak on behalf of low-income New Yorkers specifically, and I think that this figure shows that despite the fact that there are economic indicators that are showing that things are better in the city for a lot of people, I think that there's a very large percentage of people for whom things are not better. And I think that the board should very much think about this as they're making their decision.
Could you explain figure 8 a little bit more? For example, is this including all low-income tenants who currently are spending more than 30% or 50% of their income on housing, or is it people who are currently spending less than that but would be cost burden with a $25 rent increase?
So this data is from Community Service Society's Unheard Third Survey, which is a survey that CSS does every single year, where we poll low-income New Yorkers. We have been doing this survey, I think, for 19 years, so we have a lot of data going back. And it's where the way that this data is generated, we ask people whether or not what kind of housing they live in. So, and we ask people, we kind of like figure out if they're low income or not. So this is all low income rent stabilized tenants, but we don't have the kind of data that you're describing. So I wouldn't be able to say where they are.
So this is a response of whether or not they could afford a $25 increase.
Yeah.
Their own perception of whether or not they can afford it.
Absolutely, yeah. This is perception,
That's
not.
helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't understand that. Thank you.
Yeah.
One question, which may not be fair, just want to know if anybody knew, about how many of the apartments are affected by major capital improvements? Just in the sense of the picture, I'm trying to draw a picture in my head of the dollar amounts people have to spend.
Yeah, I don't know that answer off the top of my head, but
That data though, right? We won't know her overlap, but we'll know how many units have MCIs. I think we have that in our data.
We have to take a look at that. I have to see if it's part of HCR's response. Excuse me. We do have the amount of money that has been spent on MCIs that we asked from HCR. How that translates into units, I'd have to go see if that's part of that or not. but certainly we can try to get to that number.
And if that data is able to be made public, that would be wonderful, because that's kind of a problem I've been having and lots of other researchers have been having, where we just don't have a lot of MCI data. So, yeah.
I just would recommend that, you would, given that your target audience that you're talking is to low income,
Yeah.
how much that would affect the groups that you're trying to speak for.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be wonderful if HCR would share that information with the public.
Just a clarifying question on figure 6. The y-axis is dollars.
Say that again?
The y-axis is dollars.
I think it's percent.
It's,
Oh, no, it's not percent.
yeah, I'm confused. I don't know.
Yeah, so basically, it's not dollars, it's basically creating a baseline in 2003 and starting from there, and then just showing the escalation of each of the variables. So it's a way to compare the data, but the actual numbers don't really mean anything. So it's a way to kind of like to make the data comparable across lines, if that makes it.
Inflation adjusted or not inflation adjusted?
All of this is inflation adjusted, yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I don't think I understood your explanation.
Yeah.
So the x-axis obviously years. So
Yep.
y is percentage? No.
Sort of, like almost, yeah. Basically, it's kind of like creating a way to measure the escalation. So you could think of it as percentage, even though it's not.
From a starting point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just have one question.
Okay. Thank you.
Can I say?
Yeah.
Do you have any information on, so the $25 increase, one way I was thinking about it was, it's a 2% increase on the average apartment, if the average apartment's $1,300 a month. Do you have any information on where your population resides within that average threshold
Yeah.
versus, obviously, the ceiling could be any number, but the floor, we don't? This board very rarely hears from someone whose rent is $1,300 or less. I mean, I think in the 5 years I've been on the board, we haven't had a single person who's testified at that level. So I would just like to know if you have any tracking of your residents, like they're low income, but are they low income because they're in $1,800 a month apartments because they can't get to the $1,300 or less, or do you have some people who are paying $500 a month and their income doesn't support it?
So it's a citywide survey that tracks low-income people all across the city. Unfortunately, it's too small of a sample for us to be able to do a good geographic analysis of where people are living. So I would make an educated guess that it's across the board. So there's probably some people who are living in units that are lower than the average. There's some people who are living in units that are higher than the average. But yeah, I wouldn't, unfortunately, we just, it's too small to be able to really get that kind of analysis.
I had one last question. So you make a procedural comment in your conclusion. You write that the RGB should institutionalize this practice, which is paying more attention to tenants' economic conditions while setting rent guidelines. So the RGB should institutionalize this practice and make its decision-making process more transparent.
Yep.
What is your recommendation for us procedurally?
So in terms of transparency, we very much, CSS and I think other advocates too, very much appreciate the publication of all of the reports that you use to make your decisions. But it would be even better if when you make your decision, you say why you're making that decision. So basically, if you call for a rent freeze or you call for a 4% increase, which of the factors influence that decision? That would be my recommendation.
But a narrative is issued each year with the reports. Do you not get that?
Yeah, no, the narrative is great, but kind of making a quantitative argument within that narrative.
Yeah, we've made that a part of the statement that the chair makes every year at the final vote.
Okay.
So that's public record. We can certainly get the, how many years you want to go back. We've been doing that since at least 2008. So,
I mean, that gets circulated to everybody here, but does it go on the website?
we don't put it on the website, no. I mean, I guess it's something we could talk about.
Yeah,
if you
yeah.
want.
Yeah.
And does that statement break down why kind of thinking, basically saying here's variable X
Yeah.
from the tenant side and here's variable Y from the landlord side?
Yeah, it's a general statement about what the different data that the decision was made on.
Yeah, it's quantitative and qualitative.
Yeah.
More qualitative, I think, but.
Yeah.
Not formulaic by any stretch of the imagination.
It's not, we gave 50 basis points to this factor, and we gave 25 basis points to this, and we negatived this. It's not a mathematical equation, but it does go into why it fell in one area versus another.
So I think and I completely understand that this is, this goes beyond math, the consideration, but I think the closer that I could get to a formula would be better.
Yeah, we don't operate with formulas, so that's the whole
Fair,
thing.
that's fair,
I
yeah.
understand from
Yeah.
research point where you're
Yeah.
coming from, but every board member has a vote, so they take into, and there's a reason we have 4 public hearings and listening to, and all that is, that's part of the consideration. So to put a formula out there, what we, the best we can do is have pointed, these are the data points that we considered this year, and that's why we voted on X. So formula would mean we're all out of a job. They may not care, but I do.
All right.
Any more questions for Oksana?
I have one little one. In figure 6, for operating costs, you say 65% of PIOC and the income and expense. I'm not sure I understood what that referred to, the 65%.
So rather than it showing the full 100% of PIOC and the expense study, I'm showing the 65% of it just because that's been kind of like the practice of the RGB's rent setting process over the last, since 2003, and I think going back before that too.
I'm not sure I understand that.
I'm sorry, I was looking for MCI data. I'm sorry, can you say that again? What was the?
Why 65% of PIAC? Why is that the?
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm using 65% because that's been the practice of the RGB, and from kind of like my perspective of not being in the RGB, that seems to track close to how much operating expenditures have been at, or the high point of where operating expenditures have been at.
Okay, and one last question. I think it was on figure 4. You referred to a gap that had closed. I didn't quite understand what you're referring to.
Sorry, say that again?
Well, I may have missed it. You referred to a gap that, I guess it was between stabilized and unregulated apartments since 2001 that had been present but ended. But anyway, I didn't quite catch what you were saying.
So I say that the income gap between regulated and unregulated units has increased.
Okay, I see
Yeah.
what you're saying. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so I can comment on that. So I believe what she's saying is that, say, for example, that price index goes up 5%, we're saying, historically, she's saying that we are compensating of that 5%, 60% of it would be 3%. So our increases are tracking at 65%, which would be a little bit more than 3% for that particular year. So I believe that's, yeah. So that's what she's saying, that we're taking 65% of the costs of increase.
Because operating costs are only 65% of every dollar.
Well, that's what this is showing when it's 50, we showed that with the audit, it was 59 cents. So we're over compensating owners according to the INE audited number.
Any further questions? Thank you, Oksana. We'd like to welcome Tim Collins from Collins, Dopkins, and Miller to the table as well. Thank you.
And we don't have MCI numbers. We asked, and they don't give it per unit or how many units are involved with MCIs, but they aren't able to obtain that data.
They don't have that data.
That's what they don't have access. I forgot exactly how they word it, but we ask every year.